I never expected a simple conversation to change everything. It was just an ordinary day, or so I thought, in a house full of extraordinary people. I'd been raised in that environment, surrounded by wealth, luxury, and expectations that no one ever openly discussed, but that I could feel every time I entered the room. My father was the chauffeur for the family that lived there, and while I was never one of them, I had my place in their world. A place that was mostly about staying in the background and observing. I had always been a curious kid, but not particularly involved in the life that surrounded me. I spent most of my time in the shadows, watching from the sidelines as my father worked and my mother attended to the house, keeping everything running smoothly. I'd hear the conversations, the laughter, and the hushed arguments, but I never really understood what was going on behind those closed doors. But one day, everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was sitting in the hallway pretending to read a book, but really just eavesdropping on the conversations happening in the house. That was my role, I suppose. I was the quiet observer, always listening but never speaking, watching the lives of others unfold while my own remained largely uneventful. As I sat there, I heard the faint voices of my mother and the lady of the house in the next room, the soft murmur of their conversation drifting toward me. But this time, it wasn't just idle chatter. I didn't mean to overhear, but as I heard their words, I couldn't pull away. They were talking about the nannies, the women who came and went, always with bright smiles and good intentions, but none of them stayed. None of them lasted longer than a few months, and that was a problem my mother and the lady of the house had discussed many times before. But this time, their conversation was different. Why can't we keep anyone? My mother's voice broke through the air, her tone both frustrated and desperate. They all start so well, but then they leave. Why can't they just stay? Why can't they get along with the kids? They're perfect in the beginning, but something always goes wrong. The lady of the house sighed heavily as if this was a problem that had plagued her for years. It's not them, it's the environment. It's too much for anyone to handle. You expect too much from them. It's your expectations, your need for everything to be perfect all the time. People can't live up to that. No one can. My heart sank as the words hit me. I'd always known there was something off about the way things were run in that house, but I had never understood it fully. Now it was becoming clear. The nannies, the staff, they were all just trying to fit into a world where perfection was the only thing that mattered, and no one could ever measure up. Maybe, the lady of the house continued, you need to loosen up. Not everyone can live like this. There's always so much pressure to maintain an image, to keep everything in place. It's exhausting, even for us. I could hear my mother pause, clearly taken aback by what was being said. But it's all for the children, for their future. They need to learn the importance of structure, of discipline, of a perfect life. The lady of the house was quiet for a moment, but then she said something that shook me to my core. That's the problem. You think perfection will give them a perfect life, but in the process, you're suffocating them, and you're suffocating everyone around you. The weight of her words hung in the air as the conversation continued, and for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just about the nannies, or the house, or the kids. It was about the constant pressure to be perfect, to live up to an ideal that no one could meet. It wasn't just the nannies who couldn't handle it. It was everyone. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. My whole life had been shaped by this unspoken need for perfection, and now I saw it clearly. I'd always been on the sidelines, watching, but I'd never understood why things were the way they were. Now I knew. It wasn't just about the staff, it was about the entire family. Perfection had become their prison. From that day on, I saw the world differently. The house, the people in it, the roles they played, they were all part of a carefully constructed facade. And the nannies, who never lasted, were the ones who couldn't keep up with the impossible expectations. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't want to live like that. I didn't want to be part of a system that required me to constantly perform, to always be something I wasn't, but I didn't know how to escape it. I was just a kid. What could I do? The next morning, things didn't feel the same. My mother didn't look at me the same way. She didn't demand the same things. It was as if something had shifted in both of us. I didn't have the words to explain it, but I knew that whatever I had overheard was the first step towards something bigger. Something that would change my life forever. As the days passed, I couldn't shake off the conversation I had overheard. It replayed in my mind like a broken record, the words echoing over and over. Perfection will suffocate you. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I knew it meant something far greater than I could articulate. At the breakfast table the next morning, my mother noticed something in my eyes. She was always observant, and despite her usual brisk manner, she had this way of reading me as if I were an open book. She looked at me over her coffee cup, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is something wrong, son?" she asked, her voice soft yet probing. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I also couldn't ignore what I now saw as the root of everything. For years, I had been too afraid to confront it, too scared to question the foundations upon which our lives were built. But now, for the first time, I felt ready to speak my truth. "I overheard you and Mrs. Thompson talking last night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "about the nannies, about the pressure, about how no one ever stays." Her face stiffened, and for a moment, I thought I might have crossed a line. But instead of getting angry, she set her coffee cup down slowly and sighed, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "It's not about them. It's about us, about what we expect, the image we want to project. It's not just about the house or the nannies. It's everything. We live in a world that demands perfection, and I want you to have the best of that world, the best education, the best opportunities, the best life." I stared at her, searching her eyes for any hint of vulnerability. What I saw was a woman who had been carrying the weight of expectations for so long that she no longer knew how to let go. I felt a pang of sadness for her, but also a deep sense of empathy. I knew that her quest for perfection had come at a cost, and she too had suffered under its heavy burden. "I know you want what's best for me," I replied, my voice shaking with emotion. "But sometimes it feels like nothing is ever enough. Like I'm always trying to meet standards that aren't even real." She looked away for a moment, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. I didn't mean for it to feel that way, but she paused, then looked at me again, her expression softening. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been too focused on building a perfect life without realizing that it was destroying everything else in the process." That was the moment everything changed. For the first time in my life, my mother wasn't just the strict, demanding figure I had always known. She was a person, flawed, vulnerable, human. It was a strange feeling seeing her like that, but it was also freeing. The conversation continued, and for once, it wasn't about what I should be doing or how I should behave. It was about us, our family, our lives, and the pressures we had imposed on ourselves. We talked for hours, opening up in ways we never had before. I realized that the house, the staff, the constant pursuit of perfection, it was all part of a cycle that neither of us could break until we truly acknowledged what was happening. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my room, I reflected on everything I had learned. I had been living in a bubble, disconnected from the truth of my own emotions. I had allowed myself to be swept up in the same need for perfection that had dominated my mother's life, not realizing that the true meaning of success was not about outward appearances, but about inner peace. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The pursuit of perfection was a prison, and it wasn't just my mother and the nannies who were trapped in it. I was, too. I knew then that I had to change. I had to take the first step toward breaking free from this cycle. I couldn't keep living for other people's approval or chasing an ideal that was impossible to reach. It was time to be real, to accept the messiness of life, and to embrace the imperfections that made us who we were. The next day, when I saw the new nanny come into the house, I felt different. I saw her not just as a hired help, but as a person, someone who, just like everyone else, was carrying her own burdens and trying to fit into a world that demanded perfection. I approached her, introducing myself with a genuine smile, free of the usual facade I had worn in the past. I was no longer hiding behind a mask. For the first time, I saw the cracks in the system clearly, and I understood why no nanny had ever stayed. It wasn't because of the kids, or the work, or the challenges they faced. It was because the very foundation of the house, of our lives, was built on the idea that nothing less than perfection was acceptable. And no one could live up to that, not even me. Over the following weeks, I began to change the way I interacted with the people in the house. I started to listen more, to be present in the moments that mattered, and to let go of the need to control everything. I began to see my mother differently too. She was still the woman who had given me everything, but now I saw her as someone who had been trying so hard to make everything perfect that she had lost sight of what really mattered: love, understanding, and connection. It wasn't easy. The pressure didn't disappear overnight, but with each passing day, I felt freer. I didn't need to be perfect anymore. I just needed to be myself. One day, when I was sitting in the kitchen with my mother, she looked at me with a softness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. "I'm sorry for pushing you so hard," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how much I was asking of you. I just wanted you to have the best." I smiled at her, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. "I know, Mom. I understand now, and I'm grateful for everything you've done, but sometimes the best thing you can do for me is to just let me be." And that was the beginning of a new chapter for both of us, one where we stopped chasing perfection and started embracing the beauty in our flaws. It was a journey that would take time, but we were finally on the right path. The following weeks were filled with small changes that felt enormous to me. Every time I saw my mother, I could see the subtle shifts in her behavior. She no longer demanded perfection from me or anyone else in the house. There was an unspoken understanding between us that we were both trying to break free from the invisible chains we had allowed to bind us. The cycle of expectations, that never-ending race to achieve a flawless life, was finally starting to loosen its grip on us. In those first few days, I felt like I was learning to breathe again, something I hadn't realized I had forgotten how to do. The constant pressure to be someone I wasn't, to meet an impossible standard, had created an underlying anxiety that I carried with me everywhere. Now, with each passing day, I began to shed the weight of it. I started to notice things that had previously passed me by. The little moments that were once overshadowed by the quest for perfection became more vibrant. I could appreciate the laughter of my younger siblings without the thought that it was too loud or unruly. I could savor the quiet moments, like sitting down for dinner without rushing through it, trying to get it over with so we could move on to the next thing. One evening, I found myself alone in the study, flipping through old family albums. I hadn't done that in years. As I looked through the pictures, I saw something that struck me. In every photograph, whether it was a holiday or a simple Sunday afternoon, everyone seemed so happy, but also so tense, as if we were all aware of the unspoken pressures surrounding us. There was one photo in particular, a family portrait from when I was about 10 years old. We all looked perfect in that picture. Matching clothes, bright smiles, eyes full of expectation. But when I looked closer, I could see the faintest lines of exhaustion in my mother's face, the strain in my father's eyes, the discomfort in the way we were all positioned. It was as if we were trying too hard to create a moment of perfection, but the cracks were starting to show. I understood then that we had been so focused on building an image of perfection that we had forgotten to live. We had missed out on the simple joys of life because we were too busy trying to maintain something that didn't even exist. I closed the album feeling a deep sense of sadness and relief all at once. We had been chasing something that wasn't real, but now, for the first time, we were letting go of that chase. The change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't some miraculous instant transformation. It was a slow, steady shift, one where we each had to confront our own fears and insecurities. My mother had always believed that perfection was the key to success, that a well-ordered, perfectly controlled life was the only way to ensure happiness. But now, she was starting to see that real happiness came from being present, from allowing life to unfold naturally, without the pressure to control every detail. The house itself began to feel different. It wasn't as pristine as it used to be, and that was okay. There were toys left out in the living room, dishes in the sink, and laundry piling up. But it wasn't chaos. It was life. It was a sign that we were living, not merely existing. I even started to notice the staff, who had always been so careful and reserved, begin to relax. They smiled more often, interacted with each other more openly. It was as if they too had been waiting for permission to be themselves, to step out from behind the mask they had worn for so long. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with my mother watching the sunset, she turned to me with a soft smile. "I'm sorry, son," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how much pressure I put on you. I just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed to succeed. But I see now that I've been trying to build something that isn't real." I looked at her, a sense of peace settling over me. "It's okay, Mom. We both got caught up in it, but I think we're finally on the right path. We don't need to be perfect anymore." She nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Maybe it's time we stop trying so hard to control everything and just let it be." And with those words, something shifted again, deeper this time. We weren't just talking about letting go of perfection, we were truly starting to do it. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe without the weight of impossible expectations crushing me. It was liberating to let go of the idea that my worth depended on meeting some ideal standard of perfection. For the first time, I understood that real success wasn't about how perfect our lives looked. It was about how well we could live with the imperfections, the flaws, and the messes that made us human. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see a shift in myself too. I started to let go of the need to be perfect in every aspect of my life. I stopped overthinking every decision, worrying about what others would think. I embraced my own flaws and accepted that mistakes were part of growth. And in doing so, I found a new sense of freedom. I began to look at the world with new eyes. I saw beauty in the imperfect moments, the ones I had once overlooked in my quest for perfection. A spilled drink, a missed opportunity, an unplanned detour, they all became part of the story of my life, and I realized that the story wasn't about being flawless. It was about being real, being honest, and learning to appreciate the imperfect, messy, beautiful moments that made life worth living. And so, as I walked through life with a new perspective, I carried with me the lessons I had learned in that house. That perfection is a myth, that the pursuit of it will only bring exhaustion and disappointment, and that true happiness comes not from striving for an ideal, but from embracing the reality of who we are. Imperfect, messy, and wonderfully human. As time went on, I began to notice a change not only within myself, but in the way people around me acted as well. The more I embraced the idea of imperfection, the more I could see others slowly starting to follow suit. It wasn't immediate or obvious at first, but over the months, it became clear. People began to relax. They smiled more easily, shared their thoughts without fear of judgment, and allowed themselves to make mistakes without the burden of guilt that used to follow every misstep. My relationship with my mother, too, grew stronger as we both shed the heavy weight of our past expectations. We started talking more openly, not just about the perfect things that we hoped to achieve, but about the failures, the setbacks, and the fears that we had hidden away for so long. Those conversations weren't always easy, they didn't always have clear resolutions, but they were real, and they brought us closer, building a bond that was no longer based on the illusion of perfection, but on the reality of who we both were. There were moments, of course, when the old habits crept back in. I'd catch myself worrying about what others thought or striving to meet an unrealistic standard. My mother, too, would sometimes fall back into her old patterns, trying to manage everything with that same desire for control. But now, we both had the tools to recognize those moments for what they were. They were just fleeting thoughts, not truths that we had to live by, and we learned bit by bit to let go of them and embrace the messiness of life instead. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, my mother turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I used to think that perfection was the only way to protect you, to give you a better life, but I see now that I've been holding on to something that was only hurting us." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "I understand, Mom. We both got caught up in it, but now we're finally starting to live." Really live. A soft breeze blew through the trees, and for a moment everything felt perfectly in place. Not because it was flawless, but because it was real. The imperfections, the cracks in the facade, the quiet moments of vulnerability, we had come to accept them, and in doing so, we had created something much more meaningful than any picture-perfect image could offer. That night, after my mother went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything that had changed. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I no longer had to be someone I wasn't. I could just be me. For the first time in my life, I was free of the constant pressure to meet external expectations, to be the perfect version of myself that the world wanted me to be. I didn't have to keep pretending. I thought about the nannies who had come and gone over the years. They weren't failures as I had once believed. They were just people, like everyone else, caught in the same trap of trying to live up to impossible standards. Some of them had left because they couldn't handle the pressure, but many had stayed for as long as they could, only to realize, like I had, that living in a world of perfection was ultimately unsustainable. I remembered the last nanny who had lasted the longest. She had been kind, warm, and patient with us, especially with my younger siblings. But I'd noticed something different about her from the start. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She didn't try to control every moment, every action. She let the children play freely, allowed them to make messes, and never seemed bothered by the little things that used to make my mother anxious. It wasn't that she didn't care about the children. It was that she understood something that I had only just started to learn. That life wasn't about keeping everything neat and tidy. It was about letting things unfold, about accepting the chaos and finding joy in it. As I reflected on that, I realized something profound. The nannies who had stayed the longest weren't the ones who tried to be perfect. They were the ones who understood that life was messy and imperfect, but that there was beauty in that mess. They didn't strive to be flawless. They simply allowed themselves to be human, and in that realization, I found a new sense of peace. I understood now that the key to living a fulfilling life wasn't about chasing perfection. It was about embracing the imperfections, learning to live with them, and finding the beauty in the chaos. The next time I saw my mother, I smiled and sat beside her. "I think we've both learned something important," I said, looking at her with newfound understanding. She smiled back, her eyes filled with warmth. "Yes, we have, and I think we're finally starting to live the way we were always meant to." And in that moment, I knew we had. The journey toward accepting ourselves, with all our flaws and imperfections, had brought us closer, not only to each other, but to the truth of who we were. We didn't need to be perfect anymore. We just needed to be real. As I looked out at the world around me, I realized that this new path, this path of authenticity, was the one I was meant to walk. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was enough. Life wasn't about being flawless. It was about being human, about finding meaning in the mess and discovering the beauty in the journey. And with that realization, I felt free. As I walked through life with this newfound perspective, things started to feel different. The weight that had once been so heavy on my shoulders, an invisible burden of perfection, began to fade away. I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't anymore. I didn't have to follow a script that someone else had written for me. I was free to make mistakes, to be flawed, and to experience life in its rawest, most genuine form. At first, it felt strange. I had been conditioned for so long to believe that success and happiness came from meeting certain expectations, from maintaining an image of flawlessness. But as I embraced my imperfections, I realized that the things I had been chasing weren't even the things that truly mattered. The perfect grades, the perfect job, the perfect relationship, none of it was as fulfilling as simply being present in the moment, enjoying life as it came. I noticed this change not only in myself, but in the way I began to connect with others. People were drawn to this new energy I was putting out. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. And that realness created connections that felt deeper and more meaningful than anything I had ever experienced before. I started to reach out to old friends, reconnecting with those I had once distanced myself from because I thought they didn't meet some ideal version of success or happiness. I invited them to be part of my journey, and I realized that in doing so, I wasn't just letting go of my need for perfection. I was allowing others to be real too. I wasn't asking them to fit into a mold. I was accepting them for who they were, flaws, mistakes, and all, and in turn, they did the same for me. They didn't expect me to be perfect anymore. They didn't expect me to always have it together. And in that space of mutual acceptance, I found a deep sense of peace. But perhaps the biggest change came with my mother. We had come a long way from the rigid, perfection-driven relationship we once shared. As time passed, we spent more time together, not in the pursuit of some unattainable ideal, but in the enjoyment of each other's company. We laughed more, talked more openly, and shared moments of vulnerability that had previously been too uncomfortable to express. One afternoon, we sat together in the garden, just the two of us, sipping tea. The air was warm, the scent of blooming flowers filling the space between us, and for once, there was no pressure to talk about achievements or goals. We were just two people, sitting in silence, enjoying each other's presence. "Do you remember when we used to try so hard to keep everything perfect?" my mother asked, breaking the silence. I smiled, the corners of my eyes crinkling with the warmth of that memory. "I do. I used to think that was the only way to live, but now I know better." She nodded, her smile gentle and knowing. "I'm sorry, son. I never meant for you to feel like you had to live up to something that wasn't real." I placed my hand on hers, the connection between us deeper than it had ever been. "You don't have to apologize. We were both just trying to do our best, but I think we finally found something better than perfection." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and contentment. "We have, haven't we?" And in that moment, I realized something that I hadn't truly understood before. Perfection doesn't bring peace. It doesn't bring fulfillment. What brings peace, what brings true happiness, is the freedom to be yourself. to embrace all of who you are, the flaws, the imperfections, the mistakes, and to let go of the idea that you have to be something you're not. That's when the real magic happens. Life wasn't meant to be lived in pursuit of an ideal. It was meant to be lived in the present with all its beauty and messiness. We don't need to chase perfection because in our imperfection, we find the truth of who we are. We find our strength. We find our connection to others. We find the love and the joy that we've been searching for all along. As the sun set on that quiet afternoon, I sat back and took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. I was no longer bound by the chains of perfection, no longer held back by my own fears and insecurities. I was free to be me, authentic, imperfect, and unapologetically human, and that was enough. Life continued, but something inside me had changed irrevocably. As time passed, the old weight I used to carry, the pressure to be someone I wasn't, seemed to fade away. But at the same time, the journey of accepting my imperfections and living a more authentic life wasn't without obstacles. It was, in fact, a path full of discoveries, moments of doubt, and new challenges that required more courage than I ever thought I had. There were days when the temptation to return to the old routine called to me, as if a part of me was still tethered to the desire for perfection, to please others. The old reflection of perfection I had carried inside me for so long was hard to abandon completely. Sometimes in social gatherings or work meetings, I would catch myself feeling anxious, wanting to make the best impression possible, hide my flaws, and present a polished version of who I was. It was a constant battle, a delicate balance between the newfound freedom I was learning to embrace and the old armor of perfection I was trying to shed. But as those moments came and went, I began to deal with them differently. I no longer felt so pressured. I knew that what others thought of me didn't define who I truly was. That didn't mean I stopped trying. I just started accepting myself as I was, with all the highs and lows that came with that acceptance. With each small mistake I made, each failure I accepted without guilt, I felt as though I was breaking off another layer of perfection that had been imposed on me for years. It gave me more space to breathe, to be more human. I started to see that in fact it was these small mistakes that created moments of genuine connection with people. When I let my vulnerability show, when I shared my uncertainties, others also allowed themselves to be more human. I saw this happening in my professional life, with friends, and most importantly, with my family. One night, weeks after the conversation with my mother, something happened that reinforced everything I was learning. We were having a family gathering, one of those typical evenings that used to be filled with talk about work, results, and achievements. But this time, the tone was different. We were all more relaxed, more present, not worried about appearances, but about what truly mattered. It was during this gathering that my sister, who had always been the most reserved of us, found the space to speak about something that had been weighing on her for a long time. "I know everyone expects me to have everything under control," she began, hesitating but firm. "That I should be the person with the perfect life, with a solid career, someone who always gets it right. But the truth is, I'm scared of failing. I'm scared of not being good enough." Those words, which had never been spoken in our home before, shifted the atmosphere immediately. We all turned to her, not with judgment, but with understanding. My mother, who had always been so rigid, moved closer and embraced her without saying a word. That gesture, more than anything else, showed me that perfection was never what really mattered to us. What mattered was the support, the unconditional acceptance. That night, as we all said our goodbyes, I felt renewed. I realized that moment, that conversation, was the reflection of everything I was learning. It wasn't about letting go of perfection. It was about letting go of the pressure. And by freeing my sister, my mother, and even myself from that weight, I felt that we were all more connected than we'd ever been. We didn't need to be perfect to be worthy of love and acceptance. Life continued. I started seeing people around me differently. Those I had once thought of as perfect now appeared more human to me. I made more mistakes at work, in my personal life, but instead of feeling crushed by them, I learned to laugh at myself. I knew that every mistake was an opportunity to learn and grow, not a sentence of failure. It was during this period of self-discovery that I began making significant changes in my life. One of the first was my approach to work. Before, I had placed myself in a position where success depended on the approval of others. I worked tirelessly, seeking perfection in every project, fearing that any failure would be my downfall. But now, over time, I realized that doing my best was enough. I didn't need to seek validation from everyone I interacted with, nor did I need to pressure myself for constant results. I started investing in myself in a different way. I gave myself permission to fail, to rest, to disconnect every once in a while. I discovered that by embracing my humanity, I became more creative, productive, and happier. The results began to come, not because I was pursuing perfection obsessively, but because I was living authentically, and that authenticity attracted the right people into my life. My circle of friends also changed. People who I once saw as perfect in other times began to reveal themselves to me in ways I hadn't imagined. Deeper, more honest, and vulnerable conversations began to happen. I realized that everyone was just trying to fit in, just like I had been. Everyone was dealing with their own fears, insecurities, and flaws. And when we finally accepted our imperfections, it didn't just bring us peace, it strengthened our bonds. The process of healing and acceptance was never linear. There were days when I felt vulnerable, when the old temptation of wanting to be perfect resurfaced. But over time, those old voices started to lose their power. I knew there was nothing wrong with being human. On the contrary, that was my true strength. I found myself in a moment of introspection when I realized that the greatest lesson life had taught me was about learning how to live. Not living based on what others expected of me, but living based on what I felt was right for me. And maybe that was the true freedom. Not the freedom to be perfect, but the freedom to be imperfect and still be enough. Now, looking back, I see how all those years of pressure, of chasing perfection, had distanced me from who I truly was. But I also see how those struggles allowed me to understand what really matters. And maybe the greatest gift life gave me was teaching me that being imperfect is actually the most perfect way to live. As the months passed, the changes in me started to become more evident, not just to me, but to the people around me as well. My family, my friends, and even my colleagues at work began to notice something different. It wasn't an outward transformation in terms of appearance or achievements, but something deeper, something more intangible. It was in the way I carried myself, in the way I approached life, in the way I engaged with others. I was no longer bound by the invisible chains of perfectionism, and that freedom was contagious. At work, I no longer sought to please every boss, every client, or every colleague. I realized that the approval I craved wasn't the thing that would truly make me happy or fulfilled. It was the satisfaction of knowing I had done my best, not because I was trying to meet an impossible standard, but because I genuinely cared about the work I was doing. I stopped obsessing over every tiny detail and instead focused on the big picture, on making progress rather than being perfect. The result? I was more creative, more productive, and more confident in my abilities. I began to make mistakes, real, honest mistakes. And instead of feeling devastated, I saw them as opportunities. Each mistake was a lesson in disguise, a chance to grow and improve. I learned to laugh at myself, to admit when I didn't have all the answers, and to ask for help when I needed it. And surprisingly, this openness didn't diminish my professional reputation, it enhanced it. People respected me more for my vulnerability, for my willingness to show that I wasn't perfect. I started to attract colleagues who valued authenticity over perfection, and we began to build a more collaborative, supportive work environment. But the most profound shift happened within my family. Over time, I began to see my parents in a different light. I realized that my mother, despite her flaws, had been doing the best she could with the tools she had been given. She had spent so much of her life trying to create a perfect world for us, but in doing so, she had created an environment of unspoken pressure and expectations that had been too much to bear for all of us. And yet, I could see how deeply she loved us, how much she had sacrificed in the name of providing for our futures. I started having more open conversations with her about life, about her own struggles, about the things she had sacrificed to create the life she thought we needed. And in those conversations, we both began to heal. I learned that she had been just as trapped by perfectionism as I had been, and that the best gift I could give her was the permission to let go of it, to forgive herself for the times she had fallen short. Slowly but surely, she started to relax, to laugh more, to embrace the moments that were messy instead of trying to control every detail. And I began to see my father in a new light as well. He had always been the quiet, steady force in our family, the one who kept everything running smoothly, who never showed his emotions, and who always did what was expected of him. But I realized that in his own way, he had been living under the same pressures that I had. He had spent so much of his life trying to meet the expectations of others, to maintain the image of the perfect provider, that he had never truly allowed himself to be vulnerable. As I started to open up more, to share my own struggles, I began to see him do the same. He began to share stories of his own challenges, of the mistakes he had made, and of the times he had doubted himself. Those conversations, those moments of true vulnerability, created a bond between us that had never existed before. I had always seen my father as this pillar of strength, but now I saw him as a human being, just like me. We were both learning to let go of the perfectionism that had kept us distant, to embrace our flaws and imperfections, and to understand that we didn't have to be perfect to be loved or valued. But the most remarkable change of all came when I began to see my own value. I no longer measured my worth based on what I had achieved or how I had performed. I measured it by the kindness I showed to others, the authenticity I brought into every conversation, and the love I gave freely to those around me. I stopped trying to prove myself to the world. Instead, I focused on proving to myself that I was enough, just as I was. I no longer felt the need to be perfect, and in that freedom, I found peace. I found happiness in the messiness of life, in the unpredictable nature of human relationships, and in the beautiful chaos that made up the reality of my existence. I understood now that the imperfections weren't the things that made life hard. They were the things that made life beautiful. And as I stood at the threshold of a new chapter in my life, I realized that the journey I had been on wasn't just about breaking free from perfectionism. It was about embracing the full spectrum of what it means to be human. It was about learning to love myself, flaws and all, and giving others the same grace and understanding. It was about realizing that we are all enough, just as we are, and that we don't have to strive for some impossible ideal in order to be worthy of love and happiness. In the end, I came to understand that perfection was never the goal. The goal was to live authentically, to embrace the ups and downs, the mistakes and the triumphs, the joys and the sorrows, and to do it all with an open heart. That was the real freedom, the real success, and that was the life I wanted to live from that moment forward, one where I no longer chase perfection, but instead chase the beauty of being imperfectly, unapologetically human. As the months continued to unfold, my newfound understanding of life began to shape not only my internal world, but the world around me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't the only one changing. People who had once been distant or held rigid expectations of me started to open up too. The walls that had kept us in our separate corners, my family, my friends, even my colleagues, began to come down. I noticed that with every conversation, there was a shift. It was subtle at first, but gradually, the more I allowed myself to be vulnerable, the more I saw others follow suit. My friends, once caught up in the race for perfect careers and lives, started sharing their struggles, their fears, their mistakes. We laughed more, we cried more, and for the first time, we weren't just scratching the surface of each other's lives. We were connecting on a deeper level, a human level. One evening, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years. He was someone I used to admire. Perfectly put together, with a career that seemed to be on the fast track. I had always felt a sense of competition with him, thinking I needed to measure up, that I should be just as successful, just as flawless in my achievements. But when we met, something was different. He wasn't the same person I remembered. We talked for hours, and in the middle of our conversation, he shared something that I never would have expected. I used to think that if I had everything figured out, if I was always successful and perfect, people would respect me more. But recently I've realized that chasing perfection was making me miserable. I was so scared of failing that I never really lived. I've been trying to let go of that need to be perfect, to just be myself. Hearing those words was like a mirror reflecting my own journey. For so long I had believed that perfection was the key to success, to validation. But now, as I listened to my friend, I realized how much of the world around me was stuck in the same trap. We were all running the same race, chasing something intangible, something that wasn't real. It was in those moments, those honest, raw conversations, that I saw the ripple effect of embracing imperfection. It wasn't just my life that was changing, it was the lives of those around me too. And for the first time, I realized that this journey wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, learning to let go of the false standards we had set for ourselves and finding the courage to live authentically. But even with all the changes, there were still moments when the old fears crept in. I would catch myself comparing my progress to others, wondering if I was doing enough, if I was on the right path. Those old voices of perfectionism would try to creep back in, telling me that I wasn't doing enough, that I should be more successful, more polished. But now I had learned to recognize them. I no longer let those voices control me. I understood that my worth wasn't tied to how much I achieved or how flawless my life appeared. My worth was tied to who I was as a person, to how I showed up in the world, honestly, authentically, and without the need to be perfect. It wasn't always easy, and I knew that I would continue to face moments of doubt and insecurity, but I had learned that those moments were part of the process. I had learned to be kind to myself when I stumbled, to forgive myself when I failed, and to embrace the fact that life would never be perfect, and that was okay. As time passed, I began to see the impact of this shift in my work life as well. I stopped chasing the next promotion or accolade, not because I didn't care about my career, but because I realized that success wasn't defined by titles or achievements. Success was about doing work that mattered to me, work that felt authentic and fulfilling. And when I stopped trying to force everything into a perfect box, I found that I became more passionate, more inspired, and more connected to the work I was doing. My relationships with colleagues became deeper, and my confidence grew, not because I had achieved some new level of success, but because I had started to understand what true success meant for me. The breakthrough came one evening after a particularly challenging week. I had been working long hours, juggling projects, trying to meet expectations that weren't mine to meet. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I sat on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to just breathe. I wasn't thinking about deadlines or performance reviews. I wasn't worrying about what others expected of me. I was simply existing in that moment, feeling the cool evening air and the peace that came with letting go. In that moment, I realized something profound. True freedom isn't the absence of responsibility, nor is it the absence of effort. True freedom comes from accepting that you are enough, just as you are. It comes from giving yourself permission to stop running after an unattainable ideal and instead choosing to live in alignment with your own truth. As I stood up and walked inside, a smile spread across my face. I wasn't perfect, and I would never be, but I was real, and that was more than enough. And so, with that realization, I felt ready for whatever came next. Life wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but together we were beautiful. We were real.